Let's look at the contrast between predictable variation and unpredictable variation using examples only from English. Before I try and redefine those terms, I'd like to talk a little bit about phonological or phonetic environment. And the word environment implies something's surroundings, and this is of course the same thing. I have a blank here, so I'm trying to figure out which sound to put in this blank. And I have the surroundings or the environment of this blank. In other words, what comes immediately after it, which sounds come immediately after it, and which sounds come immediately before it. So in this environment here, I have an unknown sound followed by the sound a and the sound t. So, of course, together those would sound like at. And I'm using regular English spelling here and not IPA. So I have a sound followed by at, preceded by, well, nothing. It comes at the beginning of the word and also the beginning of the syllable because it's a single syllable word. I also know that this a is going to be a stressed vowel. Why? Because it's a single syllable word, and so it has to be the stressed syllable. So I have a blank here followed by a stressed vowel that comes at the beginning of a word and the beginning of a syllable. What sound do I insert there? Well, if I'm looking at these two sounds here, I can say that these two sounds have predictable variation. Why? Because I can always predict with 100% certainty which sound will appear here in English. It will always be this sound, the aspirated P, and never this sound, the unaspirated P. Notice that I don't have to ask myself, what is the speaker trying to say? No, I just have to look at the environment. That's enough information to tell me that this sound will appear and this sound will never appear. Complementary distribution, same thing. It means that where one sound appears, the other one will never appear. In this environment, this sound will always appear and this sound will never appear. Unnoticed sound variation. That simply means that because these two sounds are in complementary distribution and because they have predictable variation, I don't really have to think a lot about the difference between these two sounds, and I don't have to really mess with it or recognize it. My grammar takes care of it. It happens automatically without me giving it much thought. Let's contrast that with this example down here. I have the same environment, this blank followed by an at, preceded by nothing, which means it comes at the beginning of a word and the beginning of a syllable, right before a stressed vowel. And I'm thinking about these two sounds here. And if I experiment a little bit, I notice that I can put this sound here, in which case I get the word vat, and this sound also works here, fat. Those are two recognizable English words. They mean entirely different things. They have different definitions. So I can say that these two sounds don't have complementary distribution. Where this one can occur, this one can also occur. Contrast that with these two sounds. This one will appear here, this one will never appear here. In this example, this one can appear here, and this one can also appear here. So I can't tell just by looking at the sounds which of these will appear. I have to ask myself, what is the speaker trying to say? Here I don't have to ask myself, what is the speaker trying to say? Here I do. But if I look at the environment, I cannot predict which of these will fall right here. Just by looking at and a blank in front of it, I can't tell. It depends on what the speaker is trying to say. So if these two sounds both work here, and they mean entirely different things, then I certainly have to pay attention to the difference between these two sounds, because I'm trying to figure out what the speaker is trying to say, and if the speaker puts this sound here or this sound here, they're trying to say two different things, so I have to really pay close attention to the difference between these two sounds, so I call this noticed sound variation. And here I hope you recognize by now that what we understand or how we conceptualize a sound is not always how we speak a sound. In other words, in the English speaker's mind, we understand what a p sound is, but we vocalize it in at least two different ways, aspirated or unaspirated. And so whatever is represented in the mind we call a phoneme, and that is surrounded, it's an IPA symbol basically surrounded by two slashes. And whatever we say, or however we vocalize a phoneme, it's called an allophone, and it's surrounded by two brackets. This is how it works in English. In English, we have one understanding of what it is to make a p sound. And so we say that we have a p phoneme or a p phoneme, and that p IPA symbol is surrounded by the two slashes. Now sometimes we pronounce it, of course this brackets indicate that this is how it's pronounced. Sometimes it's pronounced as an aspirated p, as in pit, and sometimes it's pronounced just as a simple p, as in spit. We recognize one sound, we produce at least two different sounds. And it happens automatically. If it's at the beginning of a stressed syllable, it will always be this. Anywhere else, it will likely be this. And so this is called predictable variation. All I have to know is the sounds that surround it, and I can tell you which allophone will be pronounced. I just have to know the environment, and I can tell you which allophone will be pronounced. But the English speaker only recognizes one sound. In Hindi, however, we have a quite different situation, because of course these two sounds are pronounced, but if one sound is pronounced in a given environment or another sound is pronounced in that same environment, then it can change the meaning of the word entirely. And so the Hindi speakers have to pay very close attention to the difference between these two sounds, because it could mean the difference between one word and another word. And so we'll say that Hindi speakers have two allophones, and each allophone contains its separate phoneme. In Hindi, these two allophones have unpredictable variation, whereas in English, these same two allophones have predictable variation. I put a question for you at the bottom of the slide. Which of the above has allophones of the same phoneme? This simply is recapping what I've already said. I've already given you the answer, but if you're not able to answer it quickly, then I suggest you press pause and study the slide a little bit more carefully, or rewind the presentation a little bit until you can see the answer quite clearly. And here is the answer. In English, we have one phoneme for two allophones. In Hindi, each allophone has its own separate phoneme. So the question, which of the above has allophones for the same phoneme? Well, it's clearly English. Allophones for the same phoneme. Two ways of saying the same phoneme. This is one way of saying this phoneme, and one way of saying a completely different phoneme.